Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jason Rea. I am the Chief Learning Officer of Founding Forward. For those of you who don't know, Founding Forward is the Union League's 501c3 civic education focused charity. We do transformational programming and civic education for students, for teachers, and for citizens like all of you. And everything that we do as a result of individual donations of our supporters. Whether that is a program like this, whether that is a program like the 50 high school students who are out at our Valley Forge campus this weekend, all of that is funded by donation. And if you are interested in supporting Founding Forward and what we do, then my good friends, Dr. Dorsheimer and Peter and Laura are here and would be happy to tell you how you can help. A couple of quick rules as we're about to get started. Number one, please check your phones. I was at an event at lunchtime today and phones kept going off with the funniest rings. So please check your phones, make sure they're off. That's number one. Number two, we will have Q&A at the end. Again, we ask no speeches. We ask you to ask a question. 1 or 2 sentences ending with a question mark. Otherwise, you have failed. And please, we want no failures here tonight. Those are the 2 most important things, phones and questions. We have a great talk. We are so happy that you are here. It is now my pleasure to introduce the head of our speaker committee, Mr. Paul Snitzer.
Candice Shy Hooper is an author, former lobbyist, and former vice president of a multinational energy company. After working as an aide to the late Congressman Charlie Wilson, she discovered her true passion for history and pursued a master's degree in history with a concentration in military history at George Washington University. She serves on the advisory board of the Ulysses S. and Julia D. Grant Historical Home, has been a member of the board of directors for President Lincoln's Cottage, and the editorial advisory board of the Journal of Military History. Her first book, Lincoln's Generals' Wives, 4 Women Who Influenced the Civil War, for better and for worse, won 3 national awards. Her most recent book, Delivered Under Fire, Absalom Markland and Freedom's Mail, won 2 independent publisher book awards in the categories of American history and biography. Founding Forward is proud to introduce Candice Hooper.
Hello, and thank you all for coming this evening. It's been a beautiful day in Philadelphia. My husband and I haven't been here in decades probably, and we had the most wonderful time walking around your beautiful city and seeing the sights. But this is the real honor. I am so honored to be here this evening in this marvelous, marvelous building, which houses the dedication of the spirit of the people who saved our country in 1861. I want to thank Jason and Corey and Jessica, who have sort of shepherded me along this path to being here this evening. They are wonderful at this great organization called Founding Forward. And if you don't know them individually, I hope you do get to know them. But thank you all so much for being here. Now, I'm going to concede to older age and put on my glasses so that I can tell you a little bit more about the book. This book tower is in what's called the Peterson House, which is the house across from Ford's Theater. And it's the house in which Lincoln died, and it's an annex to it. But this tower is just of about 6,800 books about Abraham Lincoln. In the years since the Civil War, there have been more than 100,000 books written, more than one book for every day that has elapsed since the war began. The books are the reason that my book exists, because when I was researching my first book, which it was about 4 of Lincoln's generals' wives and how they influenced their husbands' careers, I ran into this man, particularly in the correspondence between Julia Grant and Ulysses Grant, named Absalom Markland. Now, that's not a name you're likely to forget, and thank God it wasn't John Smith, because that would have made things a lot more difficult to research. But I kept running across this name, and when I finished writing this book, and I realized he had something to do with the mail, and I mentioned him in the book. When I was finished with that book, I couldn't get him out of my mind, so I decided I was going to dig deeper. And I had always been interested in the question, how did all of that mail get delivered between the front lines and the home front during the Civil War? In those 100,000 books about the Civil War, there's they're on many different parts of the story of the Civil War. But the one thing that's the constant is that there's almost always a letter quoted in those books from that period. And yet, when I went to look in those 100,000 books to find how did that mail get delivered, who delivered it, there is not a book about it. Fortunately, I realized that Absalom Markland had something to do with the mail. It was mentioned in the brief introduction I had to him. But then I realized not long after that, after I started doing a lot of digging, that I had really hit the bonanza. He not only had something to do about the mail, he had everything to do about the mail. So let's start with his story. Absalom Markland was born in Kentucky. He was raised in a small town called Maysville, which is on the Ohio border. There, he went to school at something called the Maysville Academy. Went to school there with a number of interesting people, but one of them was a young man who was sent across from Ohio to be educated there, and his name was Hiram Ulysses Grant. They became close chums. There were a couple of years difference, but they were both in a debating society together. And so they did form a strong friendship. Well, Grant, apparently his grades weren't good enough for his uncle or his father to keep supporting him as he stayed with his uncle to go to school in Maysville. So his father sent Ulysses Grant off to West Point because he didn't have to pay tuition there, which he did at the Maysville Academy. And Absalom Markland continued on in his own path. Now, Maysville, you have to understand, at that time was a small town that had this sort of internal dichotomy, as many towns did along the Ohio River border. Kentucky was a slave state, Ohio was a free state, and so literally in Maysville, slaves were sold on the steps of the courthouse. And in fact, it was one of those slave sales that was witnessed by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Harriet Beecher at the time, who later used that scene in Uncle Tom's Cabin. But at the same time, just across from the Maysville Academy was this beautiful old house, the Bierbauer House, which I had a chance to visit, that was owned by a German family who hid enslaved persons in the basement under the floorboards and helped get them across the Ohio River to freedom. So in this one town where Absalom Markland grew up, where Ulysses Grant went to school, everybody sort of, well, knew that they were in what Lincoln later called a house divided in one town. So Markland, Absalom Markland, went from Maysville Academy. He studied the law, as one did in those days, by sort of picking it up along the way or studying under a judge or another lawyer. He was a steamboat clerk, and then he went to Washington, D.C. with his father, who was a pension clerk. But along the way, he decided to do this. This is the first time his name ever appears in print anywhere. And they spelled it wrong, which is, you know, sort of, that's what happens with the press sometimes. But he was what was called a traveling agent. And that was sort of like an independent FedEx man back in the day when the US mail really at that time mostly carried newspapers, carried some letters, and almost never carried packages. And so there were other companies like American Express started back in those days that would carry packages and carry money safely. And so he was one of those, and that gave him an introduction to the geography of that area of Kentucky, Ohio, and on down into Tennessee that would later come in handy for him during the Civil War. But so he's in Washington, and in 1850, he marries a woman named Martha Sims. And I just love this picture. This is the only photograph that I've been able to find that exists of her. This is one of only 3 actual photographs of Absalom that exist. But you look at this is a young couple just starting out, being married in 1850. And you can just sort of get a sense of this young couple hopeful for the future and moving ahead and trying to make their way. They were a very devoted couple all of their life. And Martha traveled to be with her husband in all sorts of places, just as Julia Grant did. In my first book, I talked about how Julia Grant traveled more than 10,000 miles during the 4 years of the Civil War to be with her husband. And that was in spite of a very serious eye defect that she had. But because Grant welcomed his wife to be with him, then when Markland was with Grant in camp, Martha could be with him. Unlike, just as a sidebar, William Tecumseh Sherman, who didn't want any women anywhere near his camp. But what we know about Markland, what we know about Absalom Markland, what we know about Martha Markland, in terms of sort of their interior worlds, in terms of their personality, there's very little available. There are about 25 letters that she saved that he wrote to her. And this is not unusual. You oftentimes have more letters from the men that are saved by the women than the men save on the road or as they are campaigning. Oftentimes in the Civil War, the soldiers, the generals particularly, would destroy their letters from their wives because they were concerned that if their camp were overrun, as it was at Shiloh, where the Confederates were reading Sherman's letters from home, they could learn about what was going on at home. And so you have this imbalance in letters. But the fact that we have these 25 letters is what enabled me to write this book, because I could find out information once I turned my mind to it about Absalom Markland. Just to give you a little background into researching this, I could find information about him. I found information about him in the National Archives. I could find information about him in numerous newspapers, as we'll mention a little bit later. But you can't write a book about somebody unless you have some personal feeling. So unless you have a sense of what they are, you know, what their character is, what they think of when they're writing to their closest friends, their closest relatives. And so when I found these 25 letters in the Tennessee State Archives, I realized I could actually write this book. And just to mention something here that is relevant to the Union League and to Founding Forward, those letters were in those archives because somebody in 1932 went to a bookstore in Charleston, South Carolina, and found this packet of letters and bought this packet of letters about a nobody, somebody that nobody knew, and gave them to the Tennessee Archives. And so I just ask all of you to always remember the archives when you think about your inheritance. If you have letters from in your family, if you have artifacts in your family, please make them available to researchers by choosing a library or an archive, and including the League's archives here, which are really wonderful. But so coming back to the marriage, they're married in 1850. They live in Washington, D.C. And the war is coming on slowly. Absalom Markland, who starts out as a pension clerk, then he goes into doing other work as an individual lawyer. But as the war progresses, or as the war comes on, he decides he wants to be involved, but he doesn't want to sign up for the war. His brother is in the military. He wants to be a paymaster. He has now become sort of an interesting part of Abraham Lincoln's inner circle, even before Lincoln takes office, because Kentucky was always considered such a crucial state in the play of the North versus the South. And so he writes to Lincoln in 1861 and asks Lincoln if he could make him a military and army paymaster. And Lincoln wants him to be that. So he sends this to the War Department. Simon Cameron is the Secretary of War, gets no answer. The next day, he sends another letter to him. This is the first day, September 5th. Then he sends another letter to Simon Cameron saying, won't you make him, bring him into the army? And Simon Cameron blows him off, which is probably why Simon Cameron soon becomes minister to Russia. And Edward Stanton takes his place. Edwin Stanton takes his place. But what happens is that he doesn't get the Army paymaster job, but a fellow Kentuckian, Montgomery Blair, who's also a cabinet member as the postmaster general, brings him into the post office department and makes him a special agent. Now, special agents still exist, but they're not called that anymore. They're now called postal inspectors. And these are people who have really vast abilities to deal with crimes committed with or to the U.S. mail. If you think about, I mean, the most recent example I would guess would be when Steve Bannon was was arrested on a yacht for the fraud he perpetrated about the wall. Those were postal inspectors that arrested him. So Markland is a special agent of the U.S. Post Office, which took on great consequence in the war, as for the first time in the history of the United States, you had thousands of men leaving their homes to fight in a war and who wanted to stay in touch with their families. And most of these men, certainly in the North, were literate. This was new. This was amazing. And so you had letters going back and forth, or at least trying to go back and forth. And one of the places that becomes a real bottleneck of letters is Cairo, Illinois, which is at the very southern tip of Illinois on the Mississippi River, where there is such a terrible mess with the mail that Postmaster General Blair sends Absalom Markland there and says, go fix this mess. He goes down there, he finds a room that's about 14 feet by 14 feet, an office, just stacks of mail. On a railroad siding, there are 40 train cars full of bags of mail that have not been sorted or distributed. Mail or communication, we can call it now, is so critical in wartime. There is nothing that depletes an army's morale and its fighting spirit more than a lack of communication with people that they've left behind. And those people left behind on the home front are so incredibly anxious to learn how their loved ones are. So he gets to work on this. He begins to make a dent in it just by, as far as I can tell, just by the common sense of actually tackling the job and not crying back to Washington that you need more people. But one day while he's there, Ulysses Grant recognizes him, because it turns out that Cairo was Ulysses Grant's first command post. He was the brigadier general then, head of what was called the Western Military Department at Cairo, Illinois. The two of them, and he recognizes him even though it's been 20 years since they've seen each other, and both of them at that time were teenagers, and now they've got lots of strange facial hair, shall we say, which was popular during the Civil War. So Markland gets to work on it, and I'm not expecting you to read all of this, but this is a sample just highlighted of the hundreds of newspaper articles that begin to be churning out saying that Absalom Markland has been made in charge of the war, in charge of the mail. And how did that happen? Because Grant asked him to ask if he could help him keep the mail up to the soldiers. Now, Markland was an employee of the Post Office Department, a civilian. Grant didn't have any kind of authority over him, but the two of them just decided to make it happen. And a good thing that they did, because it immediately created a better, more morale. And as Grant knew it would, because his biggest concern all of his early life was that his wife didn't write him letters. He begged her for letters and begged her for letters and begged her for letters. So he knew what it was like to not have mail. Here's the second picture we have of Markland right about this time in 1862. They've just had the battles of Fort Henry, which Markland accompanied Grant on the boat to Fort Henry, and then he went to Donelson. And the Battle of Fort Donelson in Tennessee was one of the first real victories of the Union Army in the Civil War. It was a major victory. He captured the largest standing army since George Washington did at Yorktown. And at the same time, as his troops were moving into the fort that had surrendered, from the other side, Absalom Markland and his men were bringing the mail to those soldiers. This is how finely tuned the two of them worked together. But here he is. He's got no uniform, and yet he's called Colonel Markland. And he's called that because Grant calls him that. There's no commission anywhere. There's no piece of paper in which Grant even gives him an honorary title, but he calls him that, and everybody else does too. And what makes it, and this is one of the things that makes him so remarkable. He goes through the entire war in this dual personality, a civilian reporting to the post office, being paid by the post office, but also doing Grant's will. And as Grant has one success after another, brilliantly, Postmaster General Blair says, yes, keep doing that, keep helping Grant, because that was doing what the country needed and what Lincoln needed and what the Union needed. And interestingly, this photograph I found in the U.S. Army Heritage Center. I mean, it's, and he's not, there's no portrait of him at the U.S. Postal Museum or in the Postal Archives, but there are portraits of this civilian as a colonel out of uniform in the Army's Heritage Center. Now, I'm going to take just a quick break because, and somebody else asked me here if I talk at all about the Southern mail service. And I do in the book. I go into it, not only because, of course, it's interesting to know here on the northern side, on the Union side, you had this civilian who worked for the post office, working hand in glove with in the Western theater of the war with General Grant, and doing things sort of according to the book they were writing about how you do military mail. On the Southern side, you had somebody who was equally interesting, probably more flamboyant, left his own autobiography and was named, well, wait, oh, let me go back. Sorry. So, oh yeah, sorry. There we go, Christmas Eve. So that picture of Absalom Markland was taken in 1862. And 1862, we all know, obviously you all here at the Philadelphia Union League know, was one of the darkest years of the war. And so you have all of these remembrances in terms of the cartoons or illustrations about the importance of mail. You see the soldier there reading a letter from home. And you end up having, women going to the post office, because this is how you got your mail then. It was strictly by going to the post office. And in big cities like New York, you had the ladies' window at the post office. I wasn't able to actually find a picture of it, but this was in the plans for the Philadelphia post office. There's a ladies' window there, was planned there. And oftentimes when they went to the post office, they would end up getting a letter like this. Dear Madam, your husband was in the Battle of Gettysburg, and it is my painful duty to acquaint you of his wound and consequent death. Women would go to the post office and they would be handed a letter that would be not from their husband or son, but from a captain or major, and they would know what that meant. Or they would be handed back a package of mail that just of unopened letters, and they knew what that meant. And you would have these very, very sorrowful images and occurrences and breakdowns in the post office of women learning about the death of their loved ones at the post office. But one postmaster in Cleveland, Ohio, decided that he didn't want to see that happen anymore. And so I tell this tale, and then we'll get back to the South. But I tell this tale in the book, and his name was Joseph William Briggs. And anytime you have a letter delivered to your house, if people still write letters these days, you can thank Joseph Briggs, because he decided that he was going to, on his own initiative, have men deliver mail to the homes instead of having the women come to the post office. This home delivery of mail was instigated because of the deaths in the Civil War. Now, it might have come at some point later, but it was the enormous losses of the Civil War that triggered this. And by the end of the Civil War, there were 49 cities in the United States that had home delivery of mail. And the thing I found so interesting about this, in addition to just delivering the mail, is think about what that meant. In order to deliver mail, for the first time in some cities, there were street signs. There had to be street signs. There had to be numbers on houses for the first time. Before that, you didn't need numbers on houses. And they started passing all sorts of regulations about getting the snow off the sidewalks so that the postman could deliver the mail. But all of that happened because of the terrible death tolls of the Civil War. Now, while we're on Joseph Briggs, I'm just going to go back to the South, because there was one person in the South who was an amazing mail runner, M-A-I-L, runner, they call them, and instead of a postman. And his name was, by coincidence, Absalom Grimes. He had been a steamboat man, and he had also was from Kentucky. So in the Civil War, you have many, many coincidences, but this is one of the major ones. Absalom Grimes decided he was going to deliver mail because the Southern Post Office was simply unsustainable. John Regan, the postmaster, had been a congressman from Texas. Jefferson Davis had to twist his arm to become postmaster because the Confederate Constitution required that the Postal Service of the South pay for itself, even make a profit. And Regan knew that was never going to happen. But he launched his effort by first sort of stealing everything he could, even before war was formally declared. In the time between, as they saw it on the horizon, they began transferring the assets of the U.S. Post Office Department into Southern hands. And so when each of the states seceded, they kept all of the equipment, they kept all of the administrative officers, and most of the time they kept all of the postmasters. So essentially Regan sort of stole the postal system from the North. So a man like Absalom Grimes would go from his hometown in Kentucky and collect letters by having women hide them in their hoop skirts. And I'm sorry I didn't include that slide, but I do have a slide. They would collect them, sometimes up to 1,000 letters in hoop skirts. They would bring them to a central point. They would sort them through. Then Grimes would sneak them across the battle lines to a post where that particular group of townsmen were fighting on the Confederate side, deliver them, wait for those men to write letters back, take them back. The women would put them in their hoop skirts and then distribute them. And several of these women were caught and were certainly the ones that were caught in St. Louis were deported from St. Louis for doing this. But so you had very different systems. Virtually less than 10% of the mail that went from the home front to the front lines in the South went by regular mail. Most of it went either by friends going back and forth on sick leave or by mail runners like Absalom Grimes. So this map captures Absalom Markland's world, to come back to our man. And in particular, it gives you a sense of everywhere that he was pretty much everywhere that Ulysses Grant was, and that Ulysses Grant had his battles. Except when you get into this area, you see this is where Sherman was. And when Sherman got to Atlanta and began to petition Grant for permission to do his march, Grant gave him permission to do it, but also sent Markland to Sherman to help him organize the mail, because they knew that that would be a huge logistical challenge. And in fact, Markland decided, he came up with a ploy to divert the mail so that the Southerners wouldn't know right away that Sherman was actually heading south from Atlanta, and that wasn't just a feint, wasn't just a false move on his part. So he had all the mail sent to Baltimore. But then, on December 30th of 1864, when Sherman comes here just outside of Savannah and sets up the lines for siege of Savannah, when he gets there, Absalom Markland is already there on a boat with 20 tons of mail, which I believe is the most significant logistical effort during the Civil War. That Markland had tried to stay in touch. Even Lincoln didn't know where Sherman was coming out. He tried to stay in touch, but he also tried to anticipate Sherman's moves because he had been with him in Atlanta while Sherman was planning this. And in fact, when Sherman got to Savannah and saw that boat there, and he writes about this in his memoirs very movingly, that he made sure that that boat with that mail was the first boat that came in for the soldiers. And the soldiers who had been more out of communication with their families than if they had been on the moon for more than 2 months were overjoyed to see Markland and his boat. By the end of the war, Markland had done his duty and wanted to stay in one place with Martha and put their lives back together as so many soldiers did. And so he left the post office and became a lawyer lobbyist in Washington. Grant, of course, remained as general of the armies, and then became president. But before that happened, literally within 2 weeks of the Appomattox surrender, Markland received from Grant, that's the notice of the mail from Savannah, sorry. Markland received from Grant this magnificent memento, which is the saddle that Grant had used throughout the entire war. And as he gave it to Markland, he said, you know, that in this letter, he said that this is a token of friendship and of esteem, and with hopes that we can work together in the future. This saddle is now at the Quartermaster's Museum. But when I called the Ulysses Grant Presidential Library in Starkville, Mississippi, to ask how many gifts was Grant sort of a gift-giving guy? Did he regularly do this? They said no. They said there's only a record of one other gift that he ever gave anybody, and that was from the Mexican War, other than this saddle. So that will tell you a great deal about just how important this friendship was and this service was, and what a terrific job that Markland did for Grant, and how Grant felt that did help the morale of the troops. And as Grant had hoped, they had a chance to work together again, because when Grant became president, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the South was already in full steam. The Ku Klux Klan started in Tennessee in 1866, and it was the subject of daily entreaties in Congress by Republicans, by Northern Republicans, to beg the South to do something about this violence against free Blacks. Nothing was happening. Nothing was happening. Reports of murder, reports of arson, reports of whole towns being destroyed. Nothing. They couldn't get any legislation moving. So Grant asked Markland if he would come back out of retirement and become the head of mail for Tennessee and Kentucky. Now that seems like a very small job after the one he'd had in the war, where he was basically in charge of all the mail. But there was a reason he did this. And there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that the conversation that he and Grant and the Postmaster General that Grant had named, a man named John Creswell, who was a rabid abolitionist, he named the first Black male rail agent in the state of Kentucky. And male, M-A-I-L, rail agents were the cream of the crop. They had the highest pay because they had the most dangerous and the most intellectually taxing work. They had to be able to memorize schedules, railroad schedules. They had to be able to read as they sorted letters in these train cars. And so Markland knew exactly what he was doing by hiring this man as a rail agent. And the first day that he was on the job, he was attacked in the town of North Benson by 3 Ku Klux Klansmen. And he barely made it away with his life. But after that, Markland let Grant know what was going on, and Grant simply shut down the mail. Now think about this. Grant had a number of options. He could have said, you know, let's just take this Black man off and put a white man in the place and, you know, make them happy. He did not do that. He could have, which he did for a little while, he put on a squad of soldiers to protect this man. But finally he said, no, we're just going to stop the mail until they stop trying to attack this Black rail agent. Now that then drove the Southern Democrats in the Congress crazy, because for the first time, something that the Ku Klux Klan did had real world consequences for their everyday life. And in less than a month, a bill was drafted, passed, and signed by the president. And it's what is called the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. And it is one of the laws that was invoked by the Capitol Police who were attacked on January 6th. This is Absalom Markland. He's 60 years old. He's beginning to think, as more older people do, about what is in his family tree and what was his forefathers. And he begins to wonder whether he's actually related to Abraham Lincoln. And I had all but hired a genealogist to do that work, and COVID hit. So we haven't quite gotten to the bottom of that yet. But he died 3 years after this photograph was taken, the last one. And while his obituary was carried in hundreds and hundreds of newspapers around the country. I had to stop counting at 350 in terms of the ones that I could find. But he was pretty much all but forgotten until I stumbled across him, and the rest is sort of history. The one place he is remembered, though, is at the entrance to the Civil War exhibit at the National Postal Museum. And this is a letter from General Oliver Otis Howard. You well know how anxiously the officers and soldiers of the Army watch and wait for letters from home, and the receipt of them is the greatest pleasure they enjoy. And when a long period has elapsed and there is no mail, no news from home, a feeling of despondency and gloom seems to settle on all. The importance of the mail in the Civil War cannot be overstated. And the value of Absalom Markland, his friendship with Grant, and his duty to the country can't be overstated either. Thank you so much.
So we have a few minutes for questions. Please, there are a couple of microphones. Make sure you use it. Raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating. My question is, how did the letter writers know where to write to?
That is a great question, and I talk about that in the book. But basically, when the soldiers would write to their families, they were supposed to tell them how to direct their mail. And usually it had to do with, they would say their name, then they would say their immediate superior officer's name, and then they would say, you know, what regiment, what unit, what company, whatever, and where they were. And they'd say, you know, please do this. And the post office and newspapers would always be telling them, this is how you should do it. But the thing that really bedeviled the mail service was that these men were not static. These units weren't staying in one place all the time. And so you had Markland, and I talk about this, I think I show an example of it, sending letters to postmasters saying, sending letters to the generals saying, please give me updates on your location, you know, any major changes in your staff, so that we can keep this up. And in his papers in the Library of Congress is this one huge sheet that shows part of the Army of the Ohio and tells all of the names of the significant senior officers and what units are under them and where they are. And so that information had to keep funneling along. And it is remarkable. Ulysses Grant wrote after the war that that his men got their mail as well as for the most part, as well as any people in any a good-sized city in the United States regularly. But the real bane of everybody's existence was bad handwriting. And so lots of letters ended up in the dead letter pile.
Other questions?
Thank you, Candice. So was Robert E. Lee's resistance to the mail tied to not allowing slaves to realize they were freed, and some didn't realize for over 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation?
I'm sorry, would you say the first part of that question I did?
Yeah, was General Lee's resistance to efficient mail delivery
Oh.
tied to not allowing slaves to realize that they might be freed?
Actually, there wasn't resistance to the mail. There was simply, well, Postmaster Regan was only allowed to use intermittently any part of the railroad system in the South for mail. And the railroad system in the South was very primitive at that time. I mean, they simply did not have good railroad system. And you had mail delivered by boat. Well, there was that difficulty because those rivers were always the rivers were major battle spaces during the war. And so it was really, and they just simply lacked a lot of the materials. I talk about what are called adversity covers in the postal area. Some of you are postal experts, but you know, those are addressed and stamped and canceled envelopes. They couldn't make envelopes because they couldn't get the machinery from the industrial north. That was, or even from England, it was blockaded. And so in the South, they would make their own envelopes from wallpaper, from ledger books, from magazines. They just simply, as the war went on, lost not just the infrastructure, but really almost every aspect of just normal writing materials.
So tell me, what happened after the war? You had all this infrastructure and systems and everything. When the war ends, you've got all this, the mail stops. I mean, the volume stops.
Well, actually, the volume is, and I thank you for that question, because the volume really didn't stop because people, as I mentioned early on, when Markland was a traveling agent, the mail didn't really carry that much, what we would call mail, that many letters, because people were in the same town, you know, all their lives. After the war, as our country sort of expanded, as these soldiers who'd been out west decided, well, I'm going to move out west. You know, I'm going to leave Kentucky and go out west, or I'm going to leave Maine and I'm going to go to Ohio. You had more people who had more reason to write letters. And again, you still had this educated population. And then, of course, and I talk a great deal in the book about the letters from during the war from the Black men who were fighting for the Union and who were often writing letters to Lincoln saying, you know, could you please free my wife? And then wives saying, can you please let my husband come back because I need the help. But then you had this whole new becoming literate population to write. And so the first time you see some of the letters from freed Black people during the Civil War was like just the beginnings of this absolute blossoming of correspondence as more Blacks were taught to read and write, were allowed to, first of all, and then were taught to read and write. So the mail just actually went on.
So the concept of mail inherently assumes literacy. To what extent were soldiers in the war literate?
I'm sorry, I'm having.
So that's okay. I didn't speak very loudly. The concept of mail inherently assumes literacy. To what extent were soldiers literate?
Well, I a great story in the book about this man, this general who's reading his mail sitting on a log. And then as he gets up, a soldier next to him says, you know, could you read my letter for me? And the general says, well, sure, but you know, you should be able to read. He says, by all accounts, only those under Jefferson Davis are the ones that can't read. But you had people who wrote letters for people who weren't literate and people who read to them. And among those that are the most famous are Louisa May Alcott was a nurse, and she wrote letters. Walt Whitman was a nurse in Washington, and he wrote and read letters. Mary Todd Lincoln would visit the Army hospitals in Washington. You had lots of volunteers. And so even though there was a much higher literacy rate among the Northern or the soldiers of the United States Army and Navy, you had this whole sort of informal system that would read and write letters for those who couldn't.
Thank you. So what was the aftermath to the story about the KKK and General Grant? So he stops the mail, and then do the Southerners tell the KKK to go away? I mean, how was that resolved?
Well, the result was this law that was passed under that would allow the federal government to enforce the 14th Amendment, equality under the law, if the states would not enforce it. And that was the real problem, that the states would not take the KKK to task. And yet Grant did not believe his reading of the law and the Constitution and the 14th Amendment didn't give the federal government the ability to step into a state when a federal law was not being observed. And that's what the Ku Klux Klan Act did. And it also most notably applied in the case of anybody interfering with an official of the federal government in the performance of his duties, which is where you get the Capitol Police, as well as William Gibson, who I think is such a great hero, civil rights hero. He was a marvelous man. He was self-educated. He was a free Black. He was from Baltimore. He went to Kentucky. He taught Blacks how to read and write when they were allowed to be taught. And he started the first and largest fraternal organization for Black men that was sort of, I would guess, aligned with almost like the Union League, the principles of the Union League in support of freedom, in support of civic nature in helping. And but he's the champion, I think, for the Ku Klux Klan Act, which was a real step forward in allowing the federal government to enforce the 14th Amendment.
Ladies and gentlemen, Candice Hooper. So thank you all. Our next program is Monday, October 28th. It is going to be in Lincoln Hall. It is our annual Supreme Court preview and review. We have Will Creeley and Bob Corn Revere from the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. And that will be moderated by Michael Moreland of Villanova Law School. For lawyers in the group, there will be CLEs available. So tell your friends. Thank you for being here, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much. And there are a few books left. So if you'd like to purchase a book, Candy will be heading back and signing books. So let's sell those last few.